Okay, so what I'm going to try and cover today is basically the history of American journalism. And yeah, that's it. All right, the whole thing. Yeah. In some of this, I'll have discussed before by talking about other topics, you know, the history of the printing press and that sort of thing. And maybe I'll get a little bit of feedback from you guys if I'm like going over something that we've already talked about. I have to point out there's so many of you looking at your computer screens right now that it's just totally distracting to me. I can't do it. So, what are you looking at? Back in my day, we used to pay attention to everything. No, I'm serious. I want to know what you're looking at now. I don't feel so lonely. What are you looking at? You. Registration. Do you know that I'm teaching a film class in the fall? I'm teaching a film class in the fall. It's Comm 217G, and it's going to be Race, Class, Gender, and Sexuality in American Cinema. And you're welcome to take that class. And I'm going to teach a special topics class called Public Relations, where in this time I'm going to have a syllabus, not just a goal. Maybe. Yeah, I walked into class the first day and I said, I don't have a syllabus, I have a dream. And I still don't have a syllabus, but I should have. So I'll try and work.
But we all have dreams.
But everyone's, yeah, the point is we're doing things. So if you especially if you're loving your blog and you want to continue working on your blog for college credit and really make a project out of promoting it, then by all means, please sign up for my Comm 350R class in the fall. And that's what you can do. Sound good?
Is there a prerequisite part?
I think this class.
It is.
Yeah.
Bill?
Yes.
Is it 350 or
R.
317G?
It's the film class is 217G. The punk marketing class is 350R.
It's like intro to film class?
It's not an intro to film class. It's called Race, Class, Gender, and Sexuality in American Cinema. And it's cross-listed. So it's CINE, C-I-N-E, 217G, and a bunch of other prefixes too.
Are those only other classes you teach?
And this one,
Besides
for the fall semester. Isn't that enough? Oh my God, I can't stand it. I teach 3 classes in the fall. I'm like, I don't know, man. And I don't remember what time it is. But you should be able to find it online. Apparently your own booking got it online anyway. What are you looking at? Emailing and Twittering.
I was looking at that class section.
Yeah, all right.
So what time do you think that's going to be? Is it a night class or a day class? Or?
It's going to be an afternoon class, I think.
Afternoon.
I no longer do mornings or evenings. I only kind of, I'm middle afternoon. Those are the times I can show up and make it on time.
No 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning. I can't
even get here by 10. I'm embarrassed to admit that I'm always late. All right. Are we ready now? I'm going to lay some serious stuff on. And some of this I've gone over. So help me if I'm saying something that I've said, I've beat to death already. Be like, hey Phil, we've covered this already really well. But I think I've already made the case and talked with you in some detail about the role of the printing press and journalism in the Revolutionary War, right? We've talked about that a fair amount. All right, so let's just bring all that up again and just think about the main points that there had never been anything like that really in the history of human civilization, this democratic revolution, where one group just threw off another group, created a constitution, and boom, you know, they were a new nation state. Of course, democracy had existed in various forms before. You know, lots of people talk about the ancient Greeks. I hear also that there was some Native American influence there in certain elements of the Constitution. But the key point that I want to make about it is that, in a way, it happened through what we might call a manifestation of collective consciousness. There was a virtual public square created through the printing press and the lively newspaper culture that was going on in the colonies, right? So all these ideas were being exchanged, right? Lots of them through the newspaper, of course, also lots of them through philosophical books that were also a product of the printing press. But just first the idea that people could collectively organize that way around particular ideas, like we're all created equal and we have the right to, you know, self-determination and the pursuit of happiness and this sort of thing. You know, that was a function of the printing press, right, and journalism of the time. And then I think I've mentioned also during the war, right before the war, you know, Thomas Paine's Common Sense was that pamphlet that was printed and distributed to so many people that made the case for the revolution. And Thomas Paine did a second pamphlet, like in the midst of the war at that Valley Forge moment when all was almost lost. And it really showed the power of journalism to concentrate and organize people around particular projects, you know, which is of course also what part of democracy is about. It's all of us having the ability to think about the same thing at the same time and kind of have an argument about it in a virtual public sphere. And then of course, I think we've talked about well, maybe I haven't talked about all this, maybe I have a little bit, I don't know, but in the Constitution there are a number of things that are relevant to the press. You know, the First Amendment, of course, is the one that everybody knows. You know, it's good to bear in mind that the reason that it was in an amendment is because it wasn't in the first draft of the Constitution. You know, the first draft of the Constitution was sent out to the various state constitutions where it was rejected, right? And it was passed later after a lot of give and take with the establishment of the Bill of Rights. It's significant because that part, you know, it came from the people and from the little experiments that we were having with the state constitutions up and down the coast, right? So I'm sorry to say it was not this perfectly divinely inspired thing. It was, I mean, unless you think of divine inspiration as being manifested through a process of open public debates, right? Because there was a lot of back and forth on that sort of thing, right? And you can think of the freedom of the press, you know, that First Amendment, as a hands-off rule, right? Because the freedom, you know, the First Amendment says that the Congress shall make no law inhibiting the freedom of speech or the freedom of press, meaning freedom of journalists to say what they want to say, right? But there's also things in the Constitution that are more hands-on and proactive that are also related to the press, but that aren't at once obvious to people, unless you really have to sort of have an understanding of the context of the time. But the things that were related were the creation of the postal system. The postal system was actually, it was understood at the time that that was part of the free press. Because you can't read a newspaper if you don't get it delivered, right? And not only that, but the postal rates were set so that newspapers and magazines were given cheaper, discounted, tax-subsidized support, so that it didn't cost the sender as much to send a newspaper.
So they were
or a magazine.
subcontracting delivery to the postal service instead of having people deliver their papers for them?
Well, yeah, it was more like you could just mail the newspaper to people if you were the printing press and people were subscribing, but you don't have to pay full price. You get a super bulk thing, right?
Okay.
Which is the way that the post office actually works today. You know, I mean, you pay your money for your stuff. It's a great deal. I love how people like to complain about the post office. I think the post office is a miracle. Like, you're telling me you're going to send this thing to Hawaii, and I have to pay less than $1. I'm like, this is awesome, you know? It's a good deal, actually. Anyway, the post office, the education system, what do you call it, compulsory education. You know, that's also related to a free press issue, because a free press doesn't work if everybody can't read, you know. And then the establishment of roads also, you know, because it was the combination of a literate society, roads that, you know, the Postal Service could travel on, and then the postal system itself for delivering newspapers. Those are very hands-on things that were all there at the founding also. So there's just a kind of a dialectic of, you know, there's hands-off laws, but there's also these sort of proactive hands-on laws that were done because people were recognizing.
Can you put a date on this time period?
Constitution, man. This is constitutional
Okay.
stuff. Yeah, so 1787.
Okay.
And then, and I think I've told this story before, so I don't want to belabor it, but, you know, right away, you know, you had westward expansion. And very early on, by the early 1800s, you had this idea of manifest destiny, right? The idea that it was somehow divinely ordained that the United States would stretch to the west and be a democracy that was continental in scale. It went from the East Coast to the West Coast. Have I talked about that in here?
I think
A
you
little
have,
bit.
yeah.
And I think I've made the point that it wasn't going to work,
Mhm.
right? Because the roads weren't there and the time, and yet for democracy to work, you really needed to have instant communication, or pretty close to instant, you know, fast communication. You know, so it was the combination of, as we went west, it was the combination of the railroad and the telegraph, the electronic communication of the telegraph, that allowed for it to happen, for us to have a coordinated continental democracy where you can have instantaneous communication from the West Coast to the East Coast once the telegraph lines were up. And, you know, as the telegraph lines carried newspaper stories, right? That's why they call Associated Press a wire service. It's from back in the days when everything came off a telegraph wire. You know, they you know, code a newspaper article in New York City and then send it via Morse code to San Francisco and decode it, and everybody in San Francisco could read the same newspaper story on the same day as the people in New York. That's how the magic happened. I'm just looking at my... Okay, and then in the 1800s, throughout the 1800s, you have the evolution of the newspaper industry and the development of newspaper culture. And newspapers were popular, and they just got more and more and more and more popular. There was an explosion of titles, and there was a gradual reduction in the cost. At first, newspapers were really expensive, and then they started finding ways to bring the cost of newspapers down. Printing presses got better and more efficient. Paper got better and cheaper. And then you had guys like Benjamin Day come along. And Benjamin Day was an early 1800s newspaper publisher who's credited with inventing what's come to be called the penny press. And what he figured out was that he could sell lots of ads in the newspaper, and if he sold more ads, then he could bring the cost of the paper down. And if he could bring the cost of the paper down, he could sell more newspapers. And if he could sell more newspapers, he could charge more for the ads. And then if he could charge more for the ads, he could bring the cost of the newspaper down more. And then if he could bring the cost of the newspaper down even more, then he could sell even more ads. And it just really spiraled like this. This invention, he realized that, man, there's a lot of room in the newspaper. I could just stuff it with ads. You know, and on top of that, he did the thing with the newsboys, and he gave the newsboys an incentive that, you know, for every newspaper they sold over a certain number, you know, they'd get to keep all the profits. And so those newsboys would be out on the streets really hustling really hard, and the paper got cheaper and cheaper until pretty soon he brought it down to the price of a penny. And it became a really cheap, popular form of mass media, really the first popular mass media in that sense. And lots and lots and lots of people jumped into the newspaper business, and throughout the 1800s, it's just bigger and bigger and bigger. And, you know, giant newspaper companies, chains developed, you know, most famously the Hearst papers and the Pulitzer papers. And, you know, if you know that story, the rivalry between those two newspapers. If you ever saw the classic movie Citizen Kane, you know, Kane was supposedly loosely based on William Randolph Hearst, you know, this newspaper editor who starts out this idealistic journalist and is over time, you know, seduced by the dark side of business, and he becomes this sort of power-mad megalomaniac and uses his newspapers for his own gain, you know. And a famous story of that I think I've told in here before, you know, of how, you know, the newspaper business, the business aspects of newspapers sometimes have affected the content of the news that then winds up having huge political implications. And, you know, the famous case with Hearst was during the build-up to the Spanish-American War, and he sent, you know, he sent a newspaper photographer to go take pictures of the war, and there was this famous telegraph exchange between them where the newspaper photographer wrote back, "There is no war," and Hearst shot back very tersely, "You give me the pictures, I'll give you the war." Because he wanted a war to sell newspapers, you know, and Teddy Roosevelt kind of wanted a war to boost up his image of a tough guy, and, you know, then, you know, the Maine blew up, and
I think that's happened a lot in history.
Yeah, it happens all the time.
Yeah, and Vietnam,
Pretty much
and many
all
other
over.
times.
Yeah, it's not a good history there. But also during the 1800s, there was an explosion of types of papers. There were ethnic papers, and foreign language newspapers. Every different ethnic group had their own newspaper. And, you know, newspapers for different political groups too. You know, there were labor papers, and of course the abolitionist press, and, you know, German language, Italian language, French language, even Native American language papers all thrived in the 1800s. You know, the Civil War, in the struggle over slavery was fought in the press before it was fought in the battlefields, right? And there were these very brave white and African American publishers of newspapers who were, you know, who went through unbelievable suffering and violence and attacks on their presses and things like that again and again and again, arguing for abolition. And then in the 20th century, you know, labor papers became very important. There were anti-war papers, there were feminist papers, gay rights papers like The Advocate. And then also in the very late 19th, early 20th century, you had, well, let me back up a little bit before I introduce the development of what we think of as modern professional journalism. You know, in the old days, papers were very partisan, right? There was no idea of objectivity. There was just, you know, people telling stories. And, you know, in the early days, you know, pre-revolutionary America, post-revolutionary America, the press was highly partisan. It was very much in attack mode. It was full of all kinds of salacious stories and unsupported accusations and sexual scandals of every kind, just like today. It was a lot like today, actually. It's not like people didn't used to have sex scandals. They were all over the place. You know, the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, you know, that was known back then. You know, that was in the papers back in the day. In the late 19th, early 20th century, you had, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that bought the New York Times. Does anybody no offhand. It's in the chapter. I can tell the story. I'm forgetting his name right now. But you know, he bought the New York Times, and in that. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to mention too. So in those early days when the papers were so partisan, it didn't matter what party was in power. All the newspapers always got tax subsidized support in the postal system. And I just like to make that point. Really, I make that point because, you know, I have my own agenda that I like. I guess I would call it my own agenda. I have an agenda that I feel particularly responsible for informing people about, given the political context of specifically what's going on in America today and what's the big debate in a way between the Democrats and the Republicans. Sometimes you could call them the debate between the progressives and the conservatives. And the conservatives are all, you know, government out of everything, government don't regulate, don't inhibit free trade, we're a free market system, and an unfettered market works best. And then you've got the progressives who are saying, well, you know, we need some rules or regulations, otherwise those business guys are going to get away with murder. Plus, there's this idea that the government has a role in promoting the social good. You know, and then the conservatives are going to be like, oh, you're going to create a nanny state, and everyone's going to be dependent on government for welfare, and we're going to ruin the character of people, and they're all going to be lazy, good for nothing, welfare cheats. You know what I mean? Like, this is the way that the debate goes back and forth. And I just like to point out, when I talk about historical things, when there are things that are relevant to that debate, I like to bring it up. So like with the Constitution, it's, yeah, you know, it's very hands-off with regard to freedom of press and freedom of speech, but it's actually also very hands-on with the post office. And the post offices, they're doing something actively to promote the free flow of information. They're spending tax dollars on it. And it doesn't matter that the newspapers are partisan. No matter what party's in charge, both parties' newspapers get the tax subsidized postal rates. There's a long tradition of that in the U.S. And I just like to point it out, you know, when it comes up, which it's going to come up again. So, how we doing? You got a comment there?
Well, yeah, you asked the New York Times purchased it. It was Adolph Ox.
Ox, that's the guy's name. Ox, thank you very much. And so Ox had this idea. So into this, you know, newspaper cultural milieu of Hearst versus Pulitzer and yellow journalism. I should have told that story first. So yellow, you know, after Benjamin Day comes along and the printing press comes along, then you get the day of what they called yellow journalism. And yellow journalism just meant, well, it takes its name from the fact that there was a popular comic strip called The Yellow Kid. It was printed in color ink that really stood out. Hearst and Pulitzer, while they were fighting for each other, they started competing for readers, you know, and you know what you do when you want to compete for readers. Who can have the most outrageous story, the sexiest story, you know, the most salacious thing on the front page, the most violent image, right? That's what sells newspapers. So they were constantly trying to one-up each other. And one of the things that they would be doing would be they used to compete for who got to own and syndicate the comic strip The Yellow Kid, right? And Pulitzer would get him for a few years, and then Hearst would steal him for his papers, and then a few years later, Pulitzer would steal him back. It's kind of like what Marvel and DC comic books did with Frank Miller, if you're a nerd like I am. You know that kind of thing. So this type, this style of journalism that developed during the days when Hearst and Pulitzer used to compete for each other came to have the name yellow journalism. It takes its name from the yellow kid that they used to steal back and forth, and it kind of is the idea that that it's journalism that's driven by trying to sell papers. And it sells papers by being colorful, by being entertaining, by being sensational, but not necessarily by being sober and analytic and careful and accurate, right? So into that milieu comes Ox, and he develops this, he buys the New York Times, and he thinks, well, I'm not going to even bother trying to compete with those two guys. I'm going to just do a different type of newspaper. And what he decided he would do would be a very accurate newspaper, a carefully researched, fact-checked newspaper that was fair, that looked at things from multiple perspectives, that was very reliable. If it was in this newspaper, you could put it in the bank that it was true. And on top of that, he included every day a business section, a finance section, and a legal section, and a real estate section. And those were also sort of comprehensive. They really tried to cover all the real estate business, all the real estate listings, all the main business stories, all the main finance stories, all the main legal stories. And then when he started doing that, then you had the legals and the real estate people and the business people started subscribing to the newspaper. And then when that group started subscribing, then all of the middle class started looking at it, and they thought, well, if I want to know what the business people and the movers and shakers and the doctors and lawyers and Indian chiefs all think about something, I better subscribe to the New York Times too. And boom, you had this new model of journalism. It was a professional journalism. You know, they would use words like objectivity with the idea that they were going to be truthful and impartial with regard to what they were reporting, and it was a big success. And it continues to this day to be that. I mean, the New York Times is known as the paper of record, right, of the United States. You know, along with the Washington Post and now the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. These are like the key, you know, there's some other like major newspapers that are considered to be these very reliable sources that, you know, it's in that paper. It makes it into if it's on the front page of the New York Times, it's important. And the New York Times, the one thing that you know about the New York Times is that everybody that holds office reads the New York Times. Just for that reason, it becomes valuable, right? And of course, by the way, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but you know, they did a terrible time of reporting on, especially the Bush administration's case for the war with Iraq in the months leading up to the war with Iraq. And they did this unprecedented apology after, you know, a few months after the war started, when it came out, how many stories they dropped the ball on, and you know, how they were basically just reprinting the press releases from the administration without doing their own independent fact-checking on certain key claims that they were making. You know, particularly the case that Saddam Hussein was actively pursuing a nuclear weapons program, trying to get yellowcake uranium from Nigeria and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, comments or questions on anything so far? So, last week, in my quick discussion of the history of public relations, I also told the story of the development of muckraking journalism, right? And let me just go through the main points on that too. The muckraking journalists came out of the magazines. The thing about the magazines, unlike the newspapers, are the newspapers have that special responsibility of covering all the news every day. Magazines don't have either of those responsibilities. They don't have to cover all the news. They don't have to do it every day. And that leaves them the opportunity to cherry pick the few stories that they do want to cover and to go more in depth on them. And in the early 20th century, you had these crusading magazines. I probably shouldn't use that word anymore. You had these magazines that had an agenda of exposing corrupt political and economic power that hurt people, and doing it in such a way that telling the story could help the people, right? And the famous muckraking journalists were Ida Tarbell, who wrote about the oil industry for McCall's magazine, and Upton Sinclair, who sort of fictionalized, but also wrote non-fiction stories about the meatpacking industry, Henry Demarest Lloyd, a number of these other ones. And those magazines became incredibly popular. and people learned a lot. They for the first time, they connected the dots about how monopolistic corporate power worked to inhibit free competition in markets and to exploit workers and to produce dangerous products and that sort of thing, right? And the muckraking journalists created a political agenda that was adopted by the early progressives, including Theodore Roosevelt, later Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it was those progressive politicians who went on the antitrust campaigns against corporate monopolies, and it was under their auspices that were created minimum wage, 40-hour work weeks, right, for workers to organize in unions, occupational safety and health rules, child labor laws, and then, you know, later Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that kind of stuff. All that came from those muckraking journalists. That's the main thing that I want to tell you about that. It was an incredible moment. And, you know, muckraking journalism continues today in different forms. You know, when I mean, famous examples of modern muckraking journalism, let's go back to the 70s, you know, the Watergate investigations by the Washington Post was muckraking journalism. And by the way, if you ever want to see, if you're a journalist and you have not seen the movie All the President's Men, you just need to stop everything that you're doing and go watch the movie All the President's Men. It's a great movie with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, and it tells the story of Watergate from the perspective of the reporters who broke it, Bob Woodward and Bernstein. That's the first thing I forget.
Are you going to show that documentary this semester?
Which one?
The Most Dangerous Man in the World? The Daniel Ellsberg thing?
Yeah, that would be nice. I don't know. There's so many great documentaries. The Most Dangerous Man in the World is the story of how Daniel Ellsberg was a CIA analyst who broke the story of the Pentagon Papers, which was during the Vietnam War, and you know, the Pentagon was telling one story about Vietnam to the press and to the American public, but internally they were telling a completely different story. And Ellsberg, it was like written down in a big thick document, and Ellsberg smuggled it out and, you know, it got printed in the New York Times. That's a really great movie. Tell the Truth in Iran is another really good documentary about George Seldes, who tells the history of progressive journalism. I'll show one of them. Yeah.
In your opinion, you might be getting to this, but how do you feel like internet and like things like Twitter have had its effect on journalism? Do you think it's improved journalism or ruined journalism?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, the things that are ruining journalism are not Twitter and Facebook.
You don't think, though, that like sensationalism and like that kind of yellow journalism feel has ruined the quality?
Yeah, but that's not from Twitter and Facebook. That's from the fact that your media is dominated by this small number of giant corporations that are all about squeezing every drop of profit they can get out of you and no longer have any sense of social responsibility. And we let them get away with it through our FCC regulations and that sort of thing. What we should have is more publicly funded news. You know, the publicly funded news is the highest quality news out there. On television, the best news shows are on PBS. The News Hour is a really good news show because it's insulated from the market pressures. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have market-driven news, because that's fine too, but the best news is not driven by markets. It's PBS on TV, it's NPR on the radio, and I'll also point out Pacifica Radio News Network is like tremendous. You know, if you've ever listened to Pacific Radio with in Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, and now, and of course, you know, they have Facebook pages and Twitter alerts and their own channel on YouTube, and so you could watch the radio show on YouTube and get the podcast. So that technology for me is not really so much the problem. Although a bigger problem is going to be with regard to new digital technology. Who owns the internet? And to what extent is it getting censored and filtered either by the corporations or by government entities in cooperation with the corporations, which certainly has happened in China and some other countries. And really it could start to happen here too because of the new, I'm trying to remember, the FCC regulations that on net neutrality. Because we got to have net neutrality if it's going to work. Otherwise, democracy now is never going to load for you, and all you're going to get is Fox News. You know what I mean? And so, you know, net neutrality means that all web pages load at the same speed. But if they can get away with it, they'll make it so that, well, if you pay a fee, you get a high speed, and if you can't afford the fee, you get the low speed. And the new laws maintain net neutrality for our existing wired networks, but do you know for the wireless networks that are coming out, there is no more guarantee of net neutrality. And so I think that there's a real problem coming there. But you know, the bias of your media is generally, it's not a political bias, it's a money economic bias, and it's a bias toward the owners of the systems of the media. And those are, for 95% of the media, that's about 5 giant corporations, you know, that have their hands in the whole establishment. You know what I mean? There's only so far they go in their criticism in most mainstream news. So anyway, that was my big wrap on that. What do you think?
I think it has ruined the quality.
What's that?
I think it has ruined the quality of journalism in a lot of ways, because I feel like companies want to get stories out there as fast as they can without actually doing the research. And I mean, you even see it in just in like sports articles. Like you look at something like Sports Illustrated, which started like 25 years ago, that came out with groundbreaking articles, but now it's very condensed version of these groundbreaking articles that you don't really get the full effect of it. And so just the quality of what you're getting is not as good as what it used to be.
I could see how that could be. I mean, there's certainly a lot more content being created, that's for sure.
Yeah, there's more content, but I feel like the quality of that content is not as great.
Yeah. You definitely have to work hard to seek out alternative voices. You know, I'm more optimistic than I ought to be, but for most of my time when I'm surfing the web, I'm just amazed at what I can find. You know, but I'm very proactive about seeking out, you know, alternative voices. Like, for example, the mainstream corporate media coverage of the Occupy Wall Street movement was just horrendous. It was terrible. It was ridiculous all across the spectrum. MSNBC didn't do very well, in my opinion, either. But then you can go on YouTube, and if you have any motivation at all, oh my God, you could find so much great street journalism. It was just, I was just amazed by it. You know, but that's for a very motivated consumer. I think there's a lot on our shoulders now. Because it's not like, you know, you're going to sit back and watch the one news show and expect to be informed. Although if you are only going to watch one news show and expect to be informed, I suggest PBS and NPR and Pacifica.
I think in that aspect, things like Facebook and Twitter have like launched and progressed the quality of journalism,
Yeah.
just because you don't need to work for the New York Times to tell a story on Facebook, or you don't need to work for Fox News or anything. So there aren't the like political agenda of the medium or of the newspaper to kind of with the story. We can get stories from people on Facebook and people on Twitter, depending on how connected you are on those social networks.
Right.
So.
But now, on the other hand, just to play the devil's advocate, it was better back in the day when we had the editorial board, because then we got our facts checked, and you know, we got sources confirmed, and there was a sense that they were making decisions on what goes on the front page based on news values as opposed to some other value. But I'm with you, though. I mean, there's just so much. And I admit, I used to. There's been a switch with me, because I used to hit the New York Times first thing every morning on my computer. Now I hit Facebook first. And of course, I have a lot of my friends are news hounds, and I'll tend to see, well, what did they read on the Washington Post social reader, and who's posting, you know, what today, where, and then a lot of times I'll wind up, then I'll be reading a newspaper article, and then that'll link me sort of somewhere else. But then, of course, you also get this phenomenon where we're all in our own little enclaves, staring at our own belly buttons, and it's reflecting our own image back. You know, me and my hippie progressive friends are all reading the same stuff, and you know, maybe some of you and your right-wing libertarian friends are reading all the same stuff, and where's the common ground anymore? Where's the one thing that we all read? Where's the Walter Cronkite? There is no, it feels like there is no common ground anymore. Although then there are these moments where, you know, like what's happening today with this Trayvon Martin case. There seems to be a, we're all talking about the same thing at that same moment.
But then that lays groundwork for there to be like successful niche
Right.
opportunities. So I mean, it's easier to get into a niche now as well. So
Right. It's definitely changed. You know, I think that the quality of professional journalism has declined, but the explosion of other types of journalism means that the game is all wide open yet. I don't know where it's going to be. I still got like 20 minutes. Let me see what I was talking about. I talked about some of this stuff. I didn't do too bad today. The big thing I want to say about the crisis of journalism today, in part the reason that there's such a decline in journalism has to do with the fact that newspapers are in an economic crisis because of the internet. And you know, my own story is just a perfect example of everything that went wrong with newspapers. My whole life since I went to college, I always subscribed to at least one newspaper, maybe two, maybe three. When I first moved to Orem, Utah in 1999, I was subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret Morning News, and the Daily Herald. I had them all delivered every morning. And then, you know, I started feeling like I hated writing that check every 3 months. And then the school bought me a pretty nice computer, and then all of a sudden I started realizing I could read the newspaper online for free, and I still kept getting the newspaper delivered, but then one day I realized I don't need to get the newspaper delivered. I can just look at the newspaper online. And so then I stopped doing that, and so did a lot of other people, and subscription rates went down. And then meanwhile, along comes Craigslist and KSL.com, and all the people that used to advertise, you know, either personals or, you know, garage sales or my car's for sale, they started putting that stuff online, and newspapers lost a huge hit to that. And then meanwhile there was massive deregulation because the conservatives were all like, you need to get government off our backs and let the companies do what they want to do. And they were like, all right, you guys do whatever you want. We'll put our concerns about the vitality of the free flow of information in the public sphere aside, and we'll believe all the stuff about there's an explosion of content, and we'll let you do what you want to do, which was to combine and combine and combine. And everybody, you know, you buy as many newspapers as you can, and then you buy as many radio stations and TV stations and book publishing companies and record labels and Hollywood studios and cell phone networks and cable networks as you can. I mean, that's what they try to do. They all want to be horizontally and vertically integrated companies. And then they leveraged like crazy to make those purchases, right? Because they just were like, we're going to buy as much as we can, and we're going to borrow as much as is necessary. And then the economy tanked, and these big corporations were suddenly in huge financial straits, and the newspaper industry was hurting so bad because of loss of subscription and loss of advertising funds that they just started folding left and right, and newspapers have been folding. A lot of, it was all, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, it was more newspapers. And then the last 15 years, it's been less newspapers, less newspapers, less newspapers. They're folding like crazy. Most cities only have one newspaper. Cities used to have 2, 3, 4 major newspapers competing like crazy. Competition is good. Now we don't have as much competition for those newspaper dollars. So anyway, newspapers are having to reinvent themselves and figure out how they're going to be viable. They've cut massively in the amount of money that they spend and the amount of staff. It used to be all the major newspapers would maintain foreign offices, and they'd have professional journalists in there for years cultivating networks and stuff like that. It would be something they'd invest in for a long period of time. And they're just firing everybody, and so now there's just much lower quality news coverage going on for all those reasons, and they're borrowing and stacking, and where once you had a room full of reporters, maybe now there will just be one reporter there, and he's feeding 5 different newspapers, and so then you gotta wonder, even with this explosion of content, maybe there's a narrowing of perspective. So anyway, that's the state of journalism today. Good thing you guys are going to be our next generation of journalists. Bring important stories to the people. Does anybody have any comments? Was this a good lecture today? Covered all that stuff today. All right, so Wednesday we'll do a good blog workshop, okay? I'll see you then.